The paper on the kitchen table was a piece of a receipt torn in half. It read, "We're traveling for 5 days, Mom. Good luck. Not even a happy birthday. My name is Margaret. I turned 72 years old that very morning. I am a widow and a watchmaker by trade." What David didn't know was that I had spent years counting the seconds for him to make a mistake. The silence in a house that is usually full of people has a heavy texture, almost thick. It is not a silence that brings peace, but one that buzzes in the ears, loaded with everything that is left unsaid. I woke up at 6 in the morning, just like I have done for the last 5 decades of my life. My body doesn't need an alarm clock anymore. It has its own internal mechanism, a mainspring that tightens with the first light of dawn filtering through the thin curtains of the maid's room. That was my room now, the maid's room. Opening my eyes, I stared at the peeling ceiling. I expected to hear the heavy footsteps of my son David on the floor above, the neurotic clicking of my daughter-in-law Sylvia's heels pacing the main hallway, or the blaring volume of the videos my grandson Matthew watched on his tablet from bed. But there was nothing, just the distant hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the wood in this old house. A house my late husband Arthur and I bought with the sweat of our brows back in '78. I got up slowly. My knees no longer forgive sudden movements. I put on my gray wool robe, slipped into my worn slippers, and opened my bedroom door. The hallway was pitch black. I walked toward the kitchen, dragging my feet a little over the cold tiles. When I turned on the fluorescent light, the sterile glare of the stainless steel appliances that Sylvia had insisted on buying hurt my eyes. Everything was immaculate. There wasn't a single coffee mug in the sink, not a crumb of bread on the counter. The chairs were perfectly aligned. That was when I saw the scrap of paper. It was dead center on the breakfast table, pinned down by the salt shaker so it wouldn't blow away in a draft. I walked over, picked up the paper, and read my son's rushed handwriting. "We're traveling for 5 days, Mom. Good luck." I read the note 3 times. I didn't feel like crying. At 72, I've learned that tears are a waste of fluid and energy when you are dealing with other people's stupidity. What I felt was absolute clarity, cold and metallic. I analyzed the words. We're traveling, plural, the 3 of them. 5 days, taking advantage of the long weekend, probably heading to that coastal resort Sylvia had been talking about for weeks, complaining about how desperately she needed a break from the stress of the house. And then that last word. Good luck. Good luck with what? With not starving to death with an empty fridge? Because I knew, without even opening it, that they hadn't bothered to buy groceries. I went to the refrigerator and pulled the handle. A half-empty carton of milk, a dried-up half lemon, and a jar of mustard. That was it. They knew perfectly well what day it was. Just 2 nights ago, while we were eating dinner, I asked David if we could have a meal together for my birthday. Without looking up from his cell phone, he answered with that condescending tone he reserves just for me. "Sure, Mom. We'll order something and eat here. Don't worry." It was a lie. They were already packing their bags. They had already planned to leave while I was sleeping, sneaking out like thieves in my own house, leaving me behind on the day a family is supposed to celebrate that you are still alive. They did it on purpose. It was a power play, a way of telling me, without words, that I simply didn't matter enough to alter their vacation plans. I closed the fridge gently. I didn't slam the door. Explosive rage is for rookies. Silent indignation is for those who plan to win the war. I went to the pantry, reached behind some old cans of preserves, and pulled out a small white cardboard box. Yesterday afternoon, sensing that David's promises were worth about as much as thin air, I walked 6 blocks to the neighborhood bakery and bought a lemon cake just for myself. A small cake for one person? I hid it in there because if Sylvia had seen it in the fridge, she would have thrown it in the trash, putting on that face of fake medical concern she loves to wear so much. "Margaret, sugar is poison for your joints. I'm telling you this for your own good. Everything they have taken from me over the last 5 years has always been for my own good." I placed the cake on the table, right next to my son's miserable note. I dug through the silverware drawer. I found a solitary candle left over from one of Matthew's birthdays and stuck it right in the center of the lemon icing. I grabbed a box of matches, lit the candle, and sat down in the chair. I just stared at the flickering little flame. Contempt doesn't make a loud noise all at once. It's like dust in the gears. It builds up in silence until it stops the whole machine. I watched the wax melt slowly, dripping onto the bright yellow of the cake. My mind traveled back 5 years, to the day we buried Arthur. My husband was a good man, hardworking, honest, but with a very old-fashioned view of the world. When he died, the house suddenly felt massive. I could feel the emptiness in every corner. David, who has always had a talent for disguising his greed as filial concern, came to see me a week after the funeral. He had a folder under his arm and an expression of rehearsed gravity. "Mom, you can't stay in this big house all by yourself. It's dangerous. Sylvia and I have been talking, and we think the best thing is to move in here with you to take care of you, to make sure you have everything you need. Plus, with the economy the way it is, it makes sense for us to save on our apartment rent and use that money to maintain this property." I was in mourning, vulnerable, exhausted. I said yes. It was the greatest miscalculation of my life. The invasion was gradual, methodical, relentless. First, it was the common areas. The antique furniture Arthur and I bought from dealers was replaced by minimalist sofas and glass tables, because according to Sylvia, my things smelled old. I didn't protest. I figured it was the price of having company. Then came the assault on my privacy. One day David suggested that walking up and down the main staircase was bad for my knees. "You should move to the maid's room on the ground floor, Mom. It's safer for you, and that way we can use the master bedroom and have more space for Matthew's things." They pulled me out of the room I had shared with my husband for 40 years. They shoved me into a room with no cross ventilation, where a twin bed and a narrow closet barely fit. But the final blow, the one that showed me exactly who they were, happened 2 years ago, and it had to do with my work. I am a watchmaker. It's not a hobby. It's my trade. I learned it from my father when I was a little girl. While other girls were playing with dolls, I was taking apart broken pocket watches and putting them back together, learning the infinite patience required to place a microscopic spring with precision tweezers. For decades, while Arthur worked at the plant, I repaired fine watches, mechanical and automatic, for the most exclusive jewelry stores downtown. I never needed to hang a sign on the door. The jewelry store owners knew who Margaret was, and they brought me the pieces their own technicians couldn't fix. I had my workshop set up in the glass sunroom that looked out over the backyard. It was a space flooded with natural light, absolutely essential so I wouldn't strain my eyes. It was where I kept my tools, my special oils, my miniature lathes. It was my sanctuary. One afternoon, I came back from the grocery store and found my workbench dismantled. Sylvia was sweeping the sunroom floor, while David carried my boxes down to the basement. "What are you doing?" I asked, feeling my heart drop into my stomach. Sylvia leaned on the broom, wiping the sweat from her forehead. "Margaret, we can't have all these dangerous tools and jars of chemical solvents within Matthew's reach. He's growing up. He brings friends over. This sunroom is perfect to set up a playroom for them." "That is my workspace," I told her, keeping my voice level, even though I was boiling inside. David appeared from the basement door, rubbing his dusty hands together. "Mom, let's be realistic. You barely work anymore. You live off Dad's pension. Those little watches you fix every now and then are just a hobby. We set up a table for you in the basement. You'll be quiet down there and you won't bother anyone." Sylvia chimed in with the comment that would become her favorite catchphrase for the rest of my days in that house. "Besides, Margaret, just accept it. You're out of phase. You're too slow picking up your things. The world moves at a different speed now. You live in the past. Out of phase. That was the phrase she used. Out of sync, obsolete. I didn't argue, I didn't scream. I watched them carry 40 years of my professional life down into a damp basement where natural light was nothing but a memory. I swallowed the humiliation. I let them think they had won, and I walked down after them just to make sure they didn't break anything. What neither David, nor Sylvia, nor even my late Arthur knew was that those little watches I fixed as a hobby had generated an income far, far greater than the factory pension. Money I never touched for our daily household expenses, because Arthur was a proud man who insisted on being the primary provider. Money I had deposited over the decades into financial instruments solely in my own name, managed with absolute discretion. David thought he was the master of the universe, because when Arthur died, the will named him the administrator of his father's estate. David automatically assumed that the house and the joint checking accounts were all that existed. I never corrected him. I let him pay the water and power bills. I let him strut around the house like the great feudal lord. I let them treat me like a financial burden. I blew out the candle on my lemon cake. The thin trail of gray smoke drifted up toward the fluorescent light and vanished. I cut a small piece, brought it to my mouth, and savored the tartness of the lemon mixed with the sweetness of the sugar. It was delicious. I ate it slowly, chewing every bite in the absolute silence of the kitchen. I finished my slice. I picked up the plate and left it in the sink. I didn't wash it. I walked over to the basement door. I unlocked it, turned on the bare bulb swinging from the ceiling, and walked down the wooden steps that creaked under my weight. The smell of dampness and confinement greeted me, mixed with the metallic scent of brass and watchmaker's oil. I went over to my workbench, shoved into a corner against the stone wall. I clicked on the small articulating lamp over the desk. Its tight white beam illuminated my green cutting mat. There, resting dead center, was my most precious tool. I picked it up between my fingers. It was my jeweler's loupe, a monocle with a worn brass rim. The brass had lost its original shine decades ago, darkened by the oils of my skin and the constant friction of my eyebrow, molding itself perfectly to the socket of my right eye. I placed the loupe in my eye, locking it in with a slight twitch of my facial muscles. Instantly, the basement disappeared. The outside world faded away. My vision narrowed to a perfect circle of magnified clarity, a universe where the microscopic took on a colossal scale, where flaws invisible to the naked eye revealed themselves as mountains and craters. On the table, disassembled, lay a vintage Swiss chronograph I was cleaning. I stared at the scattered gears, the escape wheel, the pallet fork, the mainspring. A watch is a miracle of cooperative physics. Every single piece, no matter how tiny, serves a critical function. If the smallest cog loses a single tooth, or if it gathers a fraction of a millimeter of dust, the whole system fails. The watch loses time. It falls out of phase. David and Sylvia thought I was a broken gear, a useless part they could just shove aside without the machinery of their lives suffering any consequences. What they didn't understand was that I was the mainspring. I was the piece maintaining the tension of the entire structure. And today, exactly on my 72nd birthday, the mainspring had decided to snap wide open. I took off the brass loop and slipped it into the pocket of my robe. I looked at the small wall calendar hanging in front of me. My son had gifted me 5 days. 5 days of absence. 5 days with no interference. No passive-aggressive questions. No having to hide in my own home. For an impatient person, 5 days is nothing. For a watchmaker, 5 days is 120 hours, 7,200 minutes, 432,000 seconds. It is an eternity. It is more than enough time to dismantle an entire life, scrub the rotten pieces clean, and reassemble the mechanism inside a completely new case. I turned off the basement light and marched back up the stairs. This time, my knees didn't ache. There was a razor-sharp purpose in every step I took. I went straight to what was now David and Sylvia's room, my old bedroom. The door was closed but not locked. I walked in. The heavy scent of my daughter-in-law's expensive perfume and cheap aftershave choked the air. The bed was unmade, clothes thrown over the chair. They hadn't even bothered to tidy up before leaving on vacation. I walked over to the massive walk-in closet Arthur had built with his own hands. I didn't touch anything of value. I didn't care about her designer jewelry or David's vulgar smartwatches. I knelt down with some difficulty by the base of the built-in wardrobe, in the darkest corner, right there, beneath a false floorboard Arthur had installed to hide his important documents, one that David never found because he was too busy staring at his own bank accounts. There was a hollow space. I reached in and pulled out a flat, discreet brown leather folder. I opened it right on my son's messy bed. Inside were the documents that proved who I really was. The deeds to the house, yes, which were in the name of the marital estate, but also other, much more interesting papers. Passbooks, certificates of deposit, and the ledgers of a private account that had been getting fat since 1985, fed by every luxury watch I saved from ruin. I closed the folder and clutched it to my chest. I went over to the nightstand where the house landline sat, a device only I used anymore. I picked up the receiver and dialed a number I knew by heart. I waited 3 rings. Law offices of Isaac Montgomery. "Good morning," a female voice answered. "This is Margaret. Put Isaac on the line, please." There was a brief pause, then the deep, raspy voice of my attorney. a man from my own generation, an old friend of Arthur's, but whose professional and personal loyalty had always been with me since the day I asked him to structure my finances without my family knowing. "Margaret, my dear, happy birthday," Isaac said warmly. "What did they get you this year? Did they finally take you to that restaurant you wanted?" I looked at my son's unmade bed. "They gave me time, Isaac," I replied, my voice calm and steady. "They gave me 5 days of an empty house. They just left on a trip and left me a note on the table." There was a heavy silence on the other end of the line. Isaac knew exactly what the situation was in my house. He had spent years listening to me, advising me to take action, to put them in their place, to claim what was mine. And I always asked him for patience. I told him things had to fall under their own weight. "I understand," Isaac said, his tone shifting, becoming razor sharp and entirely professional. "Does this mean the time has come?" "The time has come. The watch can't take any more winding." "All right, what do you need?" "I need to see you in an hour at your office. Have all the paperwork we reviewed in December ready, and call the branch manager at my bank. Tell him I'm heading there today. Tell them to prep the transfers and the cashier's checks we talked about." "I'll have everything ready, Margaret. I'll be waiting." I hung up the phone. I went to my tiny maid's room. I pulled a small suitcase out from under the bed, a simple black fabric carry-on. I started packing clothes. 3 full changes, underwear, my most comfortable shoes, my toiletry bag with my medications. I wasn't packing for a vacation. I was packing to never return. Then I went down to the basement one last time. I took a padded metal box and packed my essential tools, my anti-magnetic titanium tweezers, my precision screwdrivers, my oils, and my brass loop, which I tucked carefully into the inside pocket of my wool coat. The heavy tools and the lathes would stay there. I could buy new ones. I had enough money to buy the entire factory if I wanted to. I zipped the suitcase shut, put on my coat, and walked down the hall to the front door. I stopped for a second in front of the full-length mirror in the entryway. I saw a 72-year-old woman with completely white hair, pulled back into a severe bun, a face lined by time, but with a perfectly straight back. There was no fragility in the image staring back at me from the glass. There was only a frigid determination. I passed through the kitchen one last time. David's note was still there, pinned under the salt shaker. "We're traveling for 5 days, Mom. Good luck." I reached into my pocket, pulled out a pen, and right below his rushed handwriting, I wrote something in my own firm, clear script. I grabbed my suitcase by the retractable handle, opened the front door, and stepped out into the street. The morning air was crisp. The sun was shining high and bright. I pulled the door shut behind me, listening to the metallic click of the deadbolt locking into place. It was my birthday, and I was going to the bank. The clatter of the small plastic wheels of my suitcase rolling over the sidewalk tiles sounded like an amplified second hand. Clack, clack, clack. It was a steady, methodical rhythm that kept me company as I walked toward the main avenue. The morning air still held that cold edge that wakes up your senses, an absolute contrast to the stale, oppressive atmosphere I had left behind in that house. At 72, walking while dragging luggage should have cost me a bit of breath. But the truth is, my lungs felt cleaner than they had in half a decade. I raised my hand and a yellow cab pulled up to the curb. The driver, a young guy with deep bags under his eyes and low music playing, hopped out quickly to help me with my bag. "Morning, ma'am. Downtown?" he asked, closing the trunk softly. "To the main branch of the Bank of Commerce, please. The one across from the old square," I answered, sliding into the back seat. The ride barely took 20 minutes, but for me, it felt like crossing an invisible border. I looked out the window as the city woke up. The metal grates of the storefronts rolling up, people rushing by with paper coffee cups, buses roaring on the corners, everyone trapped in the machinery of the daily grind, racing against the clock. I, on the other hand, felt that I had finally taken absolute control of the hands on the dial. Patience isn't simply knowing how to wait with your arms crossed. It's knowing exactly what to do in silence while everyone else believes you've given up. The taxi dropped me off at the corner of the square. The bank building was an imposing structure of gray stone and thick columns, a 1950s design built to project rock-solid stability. I pushed through the heavy glass door, and the air conditioning greeted me with its freezing breath. Inside, there was a steady murmur of low voices and the clatter of keyboards, I ignored the line for the regular teller windows and walked straight down the side hallway, the one with the wooden doors and frosted glass panels. The receptionist at the front desk, a woman in an immaculate suit, looked up from her monitor. "Good morning, ma'am. Do you have an appointment? Tell Robert Sterling that Margaret is here. He is expecting me," I said, planting both hands flat on the counter. Not even 30 seconds passed before the door at the end of the hall swung open. Robert Sterling, the general manager of the branch, walked out at a brisk pace. He was a man in his 50s, in a tailored suit with thinning hair, who always treated me with a mix of absolute respect and a certain fascination. He knew the history behind my oil-stained hands and my simple wool coats. "Margaret, it is so wonderful to see you. Please, come in. Happy birthday," he said, offering me his arm to guide me into his office. I sat down in the leather chair across from his desk. Robert closed the door, sealing off the noise from the main floor. He poured 2 glasses of water with a steady hand and sat facing me, lacing his fingers together over the mahogany desk. "Isaac Montgomery called me half an hour ago," Robert began, dropping his voice to a confidential whisper. "He told me you were coming in to make a major move. I have your files ready." I nodded slowly. I pulled the brown leather folder I had rescued from the bottom of my son's closet out of my bag. I opened it and slid the old passbooks and the most recent bank statements across the desk. "I want to close everything, Robert. Every account, every fund, every certificate of deposit under my name in this institution. I want the total balance in a cashier's check made out to me, and I want it issued today." Robert looked at the papers, and then he looked at me. There was no surprise in his eyes, only the confirmation of something that he, being a keen observer, knew would eventually happen. He was the one who had watched those numbers grow year after year. He knew that every single cent in there came from the luxury watches I took apart and put back together in the dead of night while my family slept. He knew about the 1940 Patek Philippe I saved from corrosion, the Rolex Daytona I restored piece by piece for a foreign collector. David believed my income was a grandma myth, pocket change to buy needles and thread. "Margaret, we are talking about $480,000 at today's rate. This is your life's work," Robert said, tapping the edge of a passbook with his fingertip. "If we issue a check for that amount, it needs an immediate, secure destination. I don't want you walking around the streets with that document in your purse. The destination is arranged. Isaac has already opened an account in my name at a private institution that doesn't have public branches. No one in my family knows that bank exists, let alone that I am a client. You just print the check. When a watch rusts on the inside, you can't just wipe the outside with a cloth to make it shine. You have to take it apart piece by piece, submerge the gears in solvent, scrape off the built-up grime, and throw away the parts that are no longer useful. That is exactly what I was doing with my wealth. I was extracting my life's effort from the rotting casing of my family dynamic." Robert nodded without asking any more questions. He typed on his computer for a few minutes that passed in a comfortable silence. The hum of the laser printer broke the stillness. Robert took the security paper, signed it with a sharp stroke, stamped it twice with a dry seal, and handed it to me inside a thick, dark blue envelope. I took the envelope. It weighed less than a feather, but it contained 40 years of my strained eyesight, my steady pulse, my silence at the dinner table while David and Sylvia bragged about their petty corporate achievements. I slid it into the inside pocket of my coat, right next to my watchmaker's loop. "Thank you, Robert, for all these years of discretion," I told him, standing up. "The honor has been mine, Margaret. If you ever need anything, you know where to find me." I walked out of the bank with the exact same tranquility I had walked in with. The sun was higher now, baking the tiles of the square. I walked over to a small corner cafe. I sat at an outdoor table and ordered a black coffee. I needed a moment of pause before the second stop. I was taking my first sip when my cell phone, an old, big-button device David had bought me for emergencies, started vibrating on the metal table. I looked at the screen. It read, "Son." I set the cup down on the saucer. I took a deep breath. My heart didn't speed up. I pressed the green button and lifted the phone to my ear. "Hello?" I said in my usual neutral tone. "Mom, you finally pick up. I've been calling you for 10 minutes. David's voice sounded irritated, backed by the static noise of wind whipping against the window of a moving car. "We're on the highway. Traffic was a nightmare getting out of the city. I was busy, David. What is it? Nothing. I just wanted to let you know about a couple of things I forgot in the rush this morning. Not even a happy birthday, Mom. Sorry for leaving like that. His mind operated on a track entirely disconnected from empathy. I heard Sylvia's voice in the background, shrill and whining. Tell her about the plumber, David. Don't let her forget. Right, yeah, my son continued. Mom, at 11 o'clock, the plumber is coming to look at the drain in the upstairs bathroom. Our bathroom. You need to listen for the doorbell to let him in. Don't go wandering off to the bakery at that time. And don't lock yourself in the basement with your stuff, please. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The dark liquid warmed my throat. The plumber. I understand. And one more thing, he added, using that condescending tone he deployed whenever he felt he was doing me a favor by giving me chores. If you have time this afternoon, can you sweep the dead leaves off the back patio? Sylvia says if it rains, the drains are going to clog, and we don't want to come back from our vacation to clean up a mess. Audacity is a form of voluntary blindness. David couldn't see the woman on the other end of the line. He saw an unpaid maid, a guardian of his comforts who didn't even deserve a slice of cake on her special day. Don't worry about the mess, David, I replied, enunciating every syllable with crystal clarity. I assure you, the house is going to be left in the exact state it is supposed to be in. Perfect. All right, I gotta go. I'm passing a truck. We'll buy you a keychain or something at the beach for your birthday. Good luck. The call dropped. I stared at the phone for a second before dropping it back into my purse. Good luck. There was that word again. Mediocre people always attribute to luck what meticulous people build with strategy. I left a bill under the coffee cup, grabbed my suitcase, and got back on my way. Isaac Montgomery's office was only 3 blocks away. It was an old building, one of the few that still kept those metal grate elevators and solid oak doors. I went up to the 3rd floor. The hallway smelled like floor wax and old tobacco. I pushed open the frosted glass door that read Montgomery and Associates in gold lettering. The secretary waved me right through. Isaac was standing by the window of his office, looking out at the street. When I walked in, he turned around. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, just starting to stoop with age, sporting a gray mustache and sharp eyes that didn't miss a detail. He walked over, took me by the shoulders, and kissed my cheek. 72 years old, Margaret, and you look sharper than a lot of my 40-year-old clients, he said, offering me the leather armchair across from his desk, which was covered in manila folders. I don't have time to look fragile, Isaac. Do you have what I asked for? Isaac sat down heavily in his swivel chair, steepled his fingers, and nodded. I have everything. But before you sign a single page, I want to make sure you fully understand what we are doing here, Margaret. I know you know the situation, but it's my duty to say it out loud. I'm listening. Isaac pulled a thick document from one of the folders. It was a certified copy of the deed to my house. When Arthur died, David assumed control because Arthur had signed a general power of attorney over to him a year prior, when he started feeling sick. That power allowed your son to pay taxes, handle city permits, and manage the checking account where the pension was deposited. David, in his infinite ignorance and arrogance, confused administer with inherit. Isaac paused, tapping the paper with his index finger. This house was purchased under a joint tenancy where you and Arthur owned equal shares. But Arthur's will, the one I drafted, and that David never wanted to read all the way through because the legal jargon bored him, had a very clear clause. Upon his death, his half passed automatically to you. You are the 100% owner of the property, Margaret. David doesn't have a single brick to his name. Legally speaking, he is your guest. A very prolonged guest. I nodded. I knew that. Arthur and I had decided on that to protect me. What we never imagined was that the threat would come from our own son. And the administrative power David holds, I prompted, is dead paper. If you decide it is, Isaac finished, it is canceled with your signature. The second you stamp your name on this document right here, David loses any legal authority over the house, over the bills, over everything. I want to sign it right now. Isaac slid the document toward me and offered me his fountain pen. I took the pen. The cold metal felt heavy and correct in my hand. I signed with confident strokes. My pulse didn't tremble. It was the exact same steadiness with which I placed a microscopic gear onto its axis. Done, Isaac said, pulling the paper back. Now the next step. You have 5 days before they get back. What do you want to do with the house? Do you want me to initiate a formal eviction process? It takes time, but it's guaranteed. I shook my head. A formal process meant notices, screaming matches at the door, Sylvia making a scene for the neighbors, and David using my grandson Matthew as an emotional human shield. I wasn't going to give them that stage. I am not going to fight in court for a house that is already mine. Isaac, I'm taking my space back today. I want you to hire a moving company you trust. The kind that packs everything fast and asks 0 questions. And I need a locksmith. Isaac raised an eyebrow, a half smile peeking out from under his mustache. Are you throwing them out on the street? I'm not a monster, Isaac. I am a fair woman. Tell the movers to pack absolutely every single belonging of David's, Sylvia's, and the boys. Their clothes, their minimalist furniture, their toys, their flat-screen TVs. Everything they bought. Tell them not to touch a single piece of my antique furniture or my tools in the basement. I want them to haul all their boxes to a rental storage facility on the outskirts of the city. Pay for the first month of the unit in advance. They have 30 days to figure out where to put their lives. And you're going to stay in the house alone? No. The house is contaminated with their arrogance. It's going to take time to air out. I'm going to a downtown hotel, a nice one. The suitcase I have with me has everything I need. The house will stay locked up, empty, deadbolted. You and I will have the new keys. When they get back from their little 5-day getaway, looking for the maid to wash their beach clothes, they are going to find a door that doesn't open, and a note from you taped to the wood. Isaac let out a dry, raspy laugh that echoed off the wooden walls of the office. It was the laugh of a man who had spent 5 years watching me get trampled, and who was finally watching the scales balance. Good God, Margaret, you are surgical. Arthur always said you had the coldest mind he ever met. Arthur was a romantic. I am a watchmaker, Isaac. If a part doesn't work, you pull it out. We spent the next hour finalizing the details. Isaac made 3 phone calls, one to a moving company that promised to be at my house at 1:00 p.m. with a 5-man crew and heavy cardboard boxes, another to a locksmith he trusted implicitly, and the last one to a 4-star hotel near the park, where he booked a spacious room for me with no checkout date. We left the office together. Isaac insisted on driving me. We got into his dark, silent sedan and drove back to my neighborhood. We pulled up to my house right at noon. The sun was beating down on the white siding. The street was deserted, the typical tranquility of a holiday weekend in the suburbs. The plumber David had mentioned never showed up, or if he did, he left when no one answered. I couldn't have cared less. The locksmith, a burly guy wearing a tool vest, was already waiting for us, sitting on the porch steps. Afternoon, counselor. Ma'am, the locksmith greeted us, standing up and pulling a heavy drill from his kit. Go ahead, Ray. Change the locks on the front door, the back patio door, and the garage door. Put in those maximum security cylinders you brought, Isaac ordered. I stayed standing on the sidewalk, leaning on the handle of my suitcase, just watching. The locksmith walked up the steps, jammed the drill bit right into the center of the old keyhole, and squeezed the trigger. The high-pitched screech of metal tearing into metal ripped through the quiet street. The golden shavings rained down onto the welcome mat Sylvia had bought, one that said "Home Sweet Home" in ridiculous cursive script. I watched the cylinder of the old lock give way. I watched the locksmith yank it out with a pair of pliers and toss it into the bottom of his toolbox. That was the cylinder that David and Sylvia's keys had turned for 5 years with absolute impunity. It didn't exist anymore. A few minutes later, the moving truck rounded the corner and parked in front of the house. 5 men wearing back braces walked down the rear ramp carrying rolls of bubble wrap and flattened boxes. Isaac waved them over and pushed open the front door, which already had the new cylinder installed but wasn't locked yet. All right, boys, Isaac told the movers. Everything in the upstairs master bedroom, the kids' room, and the modern furniture in the living room. Pack it carefully, but pack it fast. The lady is the owner, and I am her attorney. Everything is strictly legal. You have the whole afternoon. The men marched inside in a single file line, like an army of worker ants. I didn't want to go in. I didn't need to watch them dismantle the farce. I stayed outside, feeling the sun on my face. Isaac walked over to me and dropped a set of heavy, shiny, freshly cut keys into my hand. Here is total control. I squeezed the keys in my fist. The jagged teeth of the metal dug slightly into my palm, a tiny jolt of pain that anchored me to the present, to the undeniable reality of what I had just done. The mechanism was in motion. The gears were turning in my favor, relentless and silent. Right at that very moment, David and Sylvia were probably lying on some beach towel, drinking something cold, complaining about the price of the seafood, and believing the world belonged to them. They had absolutely no idea that their world had just been disassembled and packed into cardboard boxes. I looked at Isaac and patted him gently on the arm. "Take me to the hotel, Isaac. I have a check to lock in a room safe and a birthday cake I finally want to finish celebrating." I turned my back on the house, dragged my little black fabric suitcase toward my lawyer's car, and I never looked back. The rattle of the wheels on the asphalt no longer sounded like a second hand ticking away the weight. It sounded like recovered time. The move was made. There was no going back. The hotel lobby smelled of fresh lilies and beeswax. It was a subtle, elegant aroma, designed specifically to soothe, to tell anyone who walked through its heavy revolving glass doors that in here, the outside world with all its rush and noise couldn't hurt you. I walked down the thick carpet of the hallway, pulling my little black carry-on. The wheels barely made a sound here, muffled by the dense fabric covering the floor. Walking beside me was a young bellboy in a crisp uniform who had offered to take my bag with a genuine smile. He didn't look at me with pity. He didn't treat me with that chewed-up condescension young people usually reserve for women with white hair. He treated me like a guest, like a person who occupied a space in the world by her own right. We reached the door to the room on the 7th floor. The boy swiped the key card, pushed open the solid wood door, and flipped on the lights. I walked in behind him. The room was massive. It had floor-to-ceiling windows showing the city sprawling under the midday light, a boiling pot of streets and buildings that looked completely harmless from up here. There was a king-size bed in the center, with crisp white sheets, a dark wooden desk, and 2 reading armchairs by the window. The boy placed my suitcase on the metal luggage rack at the foot of the bed. I opened my purse, pulled out a bill, and handed it to him. He thanked me with a slight bow of his head and walked out, pulling the door shut behind him with a soft, definitive click. I stood dead center in the room. I just listened. The silence in this place was completely different from the silence in my house. The silence I had left behind that morning was a sick silence, loaded with hostility. The silence of people who keep their mouths shut because they are plotting their next hit, or because they are deliberately ignoring you. This silence, however, was clean. It was the silence of absolute privacy. No one was going to open that door without knocking. No one was going to complain that my footsteps made the floorboards creak. No one was going to tell me my presence was in the way. I walked over to the built-in closet. Opening it, I found the digital safe bolted to the back wall. I pulled the dark blue envelope Robert Sterling had given me at the bank out of my coat. Inside was the cashier's check for $480,000. My life's work. The fruit of my early mornings, of my strained eyesight, of my steady pulse. I placed it inside the safe, punched in a 4-digit code, closed the small steel door, and checked the handle. Only then, when the lock engaged and the green light flashed, did I feel my knees start to tremble. It wasn't fear. It was the sudden collapse of a structure that had been bearing an unnatural weight for far too long. The adrenaline of the morning, which had kept me sharp and precise in the lawyer's office and standing in front of the house while the locks were drilled out, simply evaporated. I let myself fall onto the edge of the massive bed. The mattress gave way with a softness that almost made me cry. My bed in the maid's room, the one David and Sylvia had assigned to me, was a narrow cot with a blown-out mattress that dug springs into my ribs every time I rolled over. They used to say a firm mattress was good for old people's posture. I kicked off my shoes, feeling the plush carpet against my bare feet. I fell backward, staring up at the smooth white ceiling, free of a single water stain. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The air conditioning hummed, just white noise. I slept. I don't know for how long. I slept with the heaviness of a stone dropping to the bottom of a well. No dreams, no tossing, no keeping one ear tuned to the door, waiting to hear the wails of my grandson or the shrieking of my daughter-in-law. When I woke up, the light pouring through the window was no longer golden. It was a deep, bruised blue. Night had fallen. The entire city was lit up. I sat up in bed, feeling a strange lightness in my neck. I clicked on the nightstand lamp and reached for the room service menu. I opened it. For the past 5 years, my diet had been strictly dictated by Sylvia. She ruled the kitchen with an iron fist and a hypocrisy disguised as medical concern. "Margaret, red meat inflames your joints," she would say, serving me a microscopic portion of boiled, unsalted chicken, while David cut into a juicy steak right in front of me. "Margaret, wine is terrible for your blood pressure," she would decree, snatching the bottle away from the table. Even though my blood pressure had always been perfect, and she was the one downing 3 glasses a night just to tolerate her own husband. I picked up the phone and dialed the hotel restaurant. "Good evening. I'd like to order dinner for room 704, I said, my voice steady. "I want a ribeye steak, medium rare, with a baked potato and plenty of butter, and a glass of red wine. The best you pour by the glass. Actually, no. Bring me the whole bottle. And a slice of chocolate cake for dessert." I hung up. Half an hour later, a waiter wheeled a service cart with white linens and silver cutlery into my room. He parked it by the window. He lifted the cloches, letting the aromatic steam of the freshly seared meat escape, uncorked the wine, and discreetly slipped out. I sat at the table. I cut the first piece of meat. The juices bled into the potatoes. I brought it to my mouth. The taste of salt, of fat, of iron, of pure life flooded my palate. I took a sip of wine. The dark, heavy liquid slid down my throat, warming my chest. I ate slowly, watching the headlights on the avenue below flowing like a river of red and white diamonds. I finished my dinner, set my silverware on the empty plate, and reached into my coat pocket. I pulled out my watchmaker's loupe, the little worn brass monocle that molded to my right eye. I put it on. I looked at the city through the magnifying glass. Everything went blurry, except for what was exactly 1 inch from my face. The loupe isn't meant for looking at the horizon. It's meant for seeing the microscopic details of what is right in front of you, to examine the hairline fractures that the naked eye misses. With the loupe on, my mind traveled back 7 years. Arthur was still alive, though his lungs already forced him to be hooked up to an oxygen machine most of the day. We were in our bedroom, the big room Sylvia would later steal from me. It was a cold, gray November afternoon. Arthur was sitting in his wingback chair, looking out the window, his breathing whistling rhythmically. I was sitting at the foot of the bed, folding laundry. Isaac Montgomery had come to the house that afternoon. They had been locked in Arthur's study for an hour. When Isaac left, Arthur called me over. I walked up to him and took his hand. His skin was paper thin, almost transparent, spotted with age. "Margaret," he told me, his voice cracked from the sheer effort of speaking, "I just signed the final will. When I'm gone, my half of the house passes directly to you. Not to David, to you. You are the absolute owner." I looked at him stunned. Arthur had always been a traditional man, the kind who believed the eldest son should inherit control of the estate to look after the widow. "Why, Arthur, David is going to be deeply offended," I replied. Arthur squeezed my hand with a strength I didn't think he had left. His eyes, sunken in dark wrinkles, stared at me with a terrifying lucidity. "Because our son is a coward, Margaret," Arthur said, every word costing him a tremendous effort. "And cowards, when they feel they have power, turn into tyrants. I raised him. I bailed him out of every debt, covered up every failure. When he stole money from the factory register to pay for his stupid mistakes at 20, I covered for him. I thought I was protecting him, but I was just rotting him from the inside out. If I leave him half this house, he's going to back you into a corner. He's going to suffocate you until you hand over what's yours. Do not trust him. I am begging you, protect yourself from our own blood." That was the last moment of genuine honesty I shared with my husband before the disease shut down his mind. Arthur knew exactly what kind of monster we had raised. His will wasn't an act of estate planning. It was a confession of guilt. It was his way of begging for my forgiveness from the grave, for having left me at the mercy of a selfish man. I pulled the loupe from my eye and set it on the hotel's white tablecloth. For the 5 years following Arthur's death, I had refused to accept his warning. I thought my husband, in his dying agony, had exaggerated. I thought a mother's love could file down the rough edges of David's character. That if I yielded, if I let him manage the checking accounts, if I welcomed Sylvia into my home, gratitude would eventually soften them. I acted like a rookie watchmaker, believing that a warped gear can be straightened out with nothing but patience and goodwill. But warped gears don't straighten out. If you leave them inside the machinery, they end up chewing through the healthy parts around them. I turned off the room light and went to sleep for the second time that day. The next 3 days passed in a routine I invented for myself. A routine of absolute freedom that gave me vertigo at first and then became as natural as breathing. On the morning of the second day, I left the hotel and took a cab to an address Isaac had given me. It wasn't a traditional bank. It was a discreet office on the 20th floor of a glass high-rise in the financial district. A woman my age, wearing a dark suit and exquisite manners, received me. There were no lines, no incomprehensible forms. Isaac had already paved the way. I handed over the cashier's check, signed 3 documents, and in less than half an hour, my $480,000 were locked into a private investment fund, exclusively in my name, shielded by confidentiality clauses that not even an army of corporate lawyers hired by David could pierce. Your assets are planted in solid ground, Margaret, the woman told me, handing me a sleek black card. No one, absolutely no one, can touch this without your physical presence and your signature. I walked out of there feeling like I was floating 4 inches off the sidewalk. On the third day, I went to a high-end department store. I walked into the boutiques I used to only look at from the outside when I accompanied Sylvia on her exorbitant shopping sprees. I bought myself new clothes, 2 fine linen blouses, a pair of soft leather shoes that didn't pinch my arches, a cream-colored coat that made me look radiant, and a beautifully crafted leather handbag. I paid for it all with my new card. I didn't feel a single drop of remorse. This was the money I had earned, scrubbing the dials of Swiss watches under a fluorescent bulb while my family slept. Now, I was dressing myself in dignity. That same afternoon, while I was having tea on a cafe terrace, my old phone buzzed at the bottom of my new purse. I pulled it out. Text messages from David. Mom went out for seafood. Everything is super expensive, but Sylvia needed to relax. Remember to sweep the back patio. Supposed to rain there tomorrow. Matthew got sunburned. He's acting like a brat. Good thing you didn't come. You would have gotten too tired. Good luck. I read the messages while taking a sip of my chamomile tea. The disconnect between the reality David thought he was ruling and the reality I had already executed was almost comical. He pictured me in the old house, sweating with a broom on the patio, babysitting dead leaves so his drains wouldn't clog, silently grateful they hadn't dragged me on the trip to tire me out. I typed a short reply. The patio is clean. Enjoy the sun. I hit send and put the phone away. It wasn't a lie. The patio was clean. The entire house was clean of them. The 4th day was the strangest of all. In the afternoon, Isaac picked me up from the hotel in his dark car. He didn't say where we were going, but I knew. We drove for half an hour toward the outskirts of the city, leaving the high-rises behind and entering an industrial zone full of metal warehouses and dusty roads. Isaac parked the car in front of a massive self-storage complex surrounded by a chain-link fence. We got out. Isaac spoke to the security guard, showed him a piece of paper, and the gate lifted. We walked down a long concrete corridor, flanked by bright orange roll-up metal doors. We stopped in front of number 405. Isaac pulled out a key, popped the heavy padlock, and yanked the handle upward. The metal door rattled up with a deafening crash that echoed down the empty hall. I stood on the threshold, looking inside. The unit was huge, the size of a 2-car garage, and it was packed to the ceiling. It was a monument to ego, meticulous, boxed up in corrugated cardboard. I saw the minimalist white leather sofa Sylvia had bought to replace Arthur's antique settee. I saw David's 60-inch TV wrapped in bubble wrap. I saw the dozens of shoeboxes holding my daughter-in-law's designer heels stacked one on top of the other. I saw the clear plastic bins overflowing with Matthew's expensive abandoned toys. Their entire lives, their entire identities, everything they considered important, banished to a concrete box on the edge of town. Isaac stood beside me in silence, waiting for my reaction. I suppose he expected me to cry, or to feel a twinge of doubt. After all, I was staring at my only son's worldly possessions dumped in a cold storage unit. Society has drilled into us that blood ties are unbreakable, that a mother must forgive every humiliation, that maternal patience is a bottomless well. But as I stared at those boxes, another memory hit me. sharp and perfectly clear, like freshly polished crystal. It happened 2 years ago, the day they decided to dismantle my workshop in the sunroom. David had carried my tables down to the basement, and I had gone upstairs to my old bedroom, the one they had already taken over, to grab a microfiber cloth I'd left behind. The door was cracked open. Sylvia and David were inside, arguing in hushed tones. I froze in the hallway. "I just can't stand her, David," Sylvia was saying, her voice dripping with venom. "She smells old. She smells like machine oil. She wanders around the house like a ghost. She makes me nervous. Matthew doesn't even want to go near her because he says Grandma is always quiet and it creeps him out." "Patience, honey," David replied, with that calculating tone he inherited from absolutely no one. "She's old. She doesn't have much time left. As long as she's here, we don't pay rent, we don't pay property taxes, and she covers her own medical bills with what the government gives her. It's a sweet deal. Let her rot in the basement with her little watches. We already own this place. She's out of phase. She doesn't belong in our world anymore. Sometimes, for time to move forward, you have to have the guts to rip the hands off the people who only know how to slow you down." In that exact moment, standing in the hallway of my own home, something inside me broke clean in two. It wasn't a painful tear. It was a mechanical snap, like when a watch's mainspring gives out from too much tension. From that second on, David ceased to be my son. He became a hostile tenant, a parasite that I would tolerate only until I had the strength and the strategy to extract him without causing damage to myself. Guilt is a slow poison you drink every day, naively hoping the other person is the one who dies. And I refused to die poisoned by the memory of a son who only existed in my imagination. Standing in front of Unit 405, I looked at Isaac. "The movers did a fine job," I said, my voice completely level. Isaac looked at me, stunned by my coldness, and then he smiled, a smile of profound respect. "Everything is inventoried, Margaret. The first month's rent is paid in your name. They have 30 days to get their stuff out of here. If they don't, the storage facility has the right to auction the contents." "That's their problem now," I replied. "Close the door, Isaac. It's getting chilly." Isaac pulled the metal door down. The crash echoed again. He snapped the padlock shut, handed me the key, and we walked back to the car. The drive back to the hotel was done in a comfortable silence. The mechanism was tuned. The old parts had been removed, cleaned, and stored away. Now all that was left was to wind the watch and let time do its job. And time finally arrived on the morning of the 5th day. I woke up early in my hotel bed. The sun was blazing over the city. I ordered a light breakfast. I took a hot shower without anyone banging on the door demanding I hurry up, and I dressed in my new clothes. I sat in the armchair by the window with a cup of coffee in my hand, and I waited. At 11 a.m., my old phone, the one sitting on the bed, rang with a shrill, piercing tone. It wasn't a text. It was a call. I walked over to the bed and looked at the screen. The word "son" was flashing hysterically. I didn't answer right away. I let it ring. 1, 2, 3, 4 rings. The call dropped. Silence returned to the room for exactly 1 second. But immediately the device started vibrating again, sliding a few inches across the white bedspread from the sheer insistence. I knew exactly what was happening at that precise moment. I pictured them pulling onto our street in their car, exhausted from the drive, sunburned and whining. I pictured David stepping out of the driver's seat, stretching, telling Matthew to grab his backpack. I pictured Sylvia walking up to the front door, dragging a beach tote, digging her keys out of her purse, sliding the metal key into the old lock. I pictured the moment the key wouldn't turn, the instant of confusion, the shoving of the shoulder against the door, the discovery of the note taped to the wood on Isaac Montgomery's letterhead, informing them that the property had been secured by its rightful owner, and that their belongings were sitting in an industrial storage unit 20 miles away. The phone on the bed stopped ringing. The screen went black, but 5 seconds later it lit up again. This time it was Isaac's number. I picked it up. Margaret. Isaac's voice was tense, but there was an unmistakable undertone of satisfaction. "Tell me, Isaac. Mrs. Higgins, your neighbor across the street, just called me. She says David's car is parked in your driveway. She says Sylvia is hammering on the front door with both fists, and David is screaming on the sidewalk, kicking the garbage cans. The show has officially begun." "Let them scream," I said, looking out the window at the city skyline. Screaming doesn't open locked doors. They are going to try to contact you, Margaret. They probably already are. I looked at the old phone in my hand. I knew it would ring again any second. I know I'm ready, Isaac. I hung up, sat back down in the armchair, crossed my legs, and took a sip of my coffee. The liquid was warm, sweet, perfect. Then the phone started vibrating in my lap again. It wasn't my son's name flashing this time. It was an unsaved number, but I recognized it instantly. It was Sylvia's cell phone. The clock had struck the exact hour, and I, for the first time in 5 years, had all the time in the world to decide when to answer. The phone vibrated in my lap with the frantic insistence of a trapped insect. I stared at the screen. Sylvia's number kept flashing, casting a cold glare off the glass. I let it ring until the device was just about to give up, and at the very last second, I answered. I didn't say hello. I didn't say absolutely anything. I just brought the receiver to my ear and let the silence on my end of the line do its work. Margaret, my daughter-in-law's shrill shriek forced me to pull the phone a few inches away. What is this insanity? We are standing in the street. The key won't go in, and there is a ridiculous piece of paper taped to the door. Open this door right now. Matthew is crying and it is boiling out here. Her voice didn't have that condescending, syrupy tone she used when telling me sugar was poison for my joints. It was the voice of someone who had just slammed into a brick wall at 100 miles an hour and still didn't understand what the bricks were made of. The door is not going to open, Sylvia, I replied, my tone as flat and monotonous as the hum of the air conditioner in my room. Because the lock is new and the house is empty. I heard a scuffle on the other end of the line, the sound of my daughter-in-law's heavy breathing, and then the deep, frantic voice of my son, who had evidently snatched the phone from her hands. Mom, what the hell did you do? David roared. I could perfectly picture the vein bulging in his neck, the sweat sliding down his sunburned forehead. I've been kicking the garage door for 10 minutes. What is this note from Dad's lawyer? It says you took our stuff out. I am the administrator of this property, Mom. I am calling the police right now and you are going to be in massive trouble. I took a tiny sip of my coffee. It was warm, sweet, perfect. Call the police, David. Please, do it, I told him, setting the cup down on its porcelain saucer with a soft clink. Call them and explain that you are trying to break into a property that is 100% in my name. Explain to them that you want to force the lock on a house where you no longer live. Mr. Montgomery will be absolutely thrilled to show the updated deeds to the officers. There was a heavy silence, the kind of silence that happens when a bully suddenly runs out of oxygen. David's brain, accustomed to always finding the path of least resistance and taking my submission for granted, was trying to process data it was never programmed to handle. Mom, his voice dropped a couple of octaves, shifting from rage to a confusion bordering on panic. What are you talking about? Where is our stuff? Where are you? We need to talk about this face to face. This is a misunderstanding. You're confused. Confused. Another one of his favorite words. They always tried to pathologize my decisions so they wouldn't have to take responsibility for their own. I am not confused in the slightest. I am in the bar of the Grand Majestic Hotel downtown. You have exactly 1 hour to get here if you want the key to the place where I left your boxes. If you arrive in 61 minutes, I will go up to my room, and you'll have to figure out on your own which storage facility on the outskirts of the city your 60-inch TV is sleeping in. I ended the call. I didn't jab the red button with fury. I swiped it with the exact same gentleness I used to snap shut the case of a freshly repaired pocket watch. I stood up from the armchair and walked over to the large full-length mirror by the bathroom door. The woman staring back at me was not the hunched old lady sweeping the back patio in a frayed robe. I was wearing my crisp new linen blouse, perfectly pressed, and the soft leather shoes that didn't pinch. My white hair was pulled back in a tight bun. I reached into the pocket of my dress pants and touched the brass rim of my watchmaker's loop. Feeling that cold little object against my fingertips was my anchor. It was the physical proof that everything about to happen was entirely earned. I left the room and took the elevator down to the ground floor. The bar at the Grand Majestic was a space designed to drown out the miseries of the outside world. It had dim, golden lighting that bounced off the mahogany wall panels and the crystal glasses behind the bar. Jazz music played just low enough to allow conversation, but loud enough to guarantee privacy for every table. The floor was covered in a carpet so thick it swallowed the sound of footsteps. It was the exact opposite of the neighborhood screaming matches Sylvia and David were used to staging. I chose a round table in a secluded corner near a window facing the avenue, shielded by a large potted plant. A waiter in a white jacket approached immediately. "Good afternoon, ma'am. What can I get you? A glass of sparkling water with ice and lemon, please. And don't bring me the check until I ask for it. I am expecting 2 people, but I don't believe they'll be staying long." The waiter nodded and slipped away. I sat with my back perfectly straight, resting my hands on the cold marble table. Mourning a child who is still alive is a strange, desolate process. When you bury someone, you cry for what was and what will never be. But when you decide to cut the cord with a child who still breathes, walks, and talks, what you mourn is the illusion. You cry for the person you thought you raised, for the little boy who once held your hand, and you have to force yourself to look at the selfish stranger he has become, without making excuses for him. David had emptied my house of memories, cornered my life in a damp basement, and treated my dignity like an old rag. I had already cried for him in silence for 5 years. I had no tears left. Only an absolute freezing clarity. It took them 45 minutes to show up. I watched them walk through the revolving doors of the lobby, and the contrast was so brutal I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. David was wearing wrinkled linen shorts and a short-sleeved shirt unbuttoned at the chest, his skin bright red and glowing from sunburn. Sylvia walked beside him, dragging her feet in beach sandals, wearing a sundress that revealed badly rubbed-in streaks of sunscreen on her shoulders. They were both sweating. They both had their eyes wide open, scanning the luxurious lobby with a mix of fury and sheer disorientation. They looked like 2 castaways the ocean had just spit out into the middle of a black tie gala. I raised my hand slowly. David spotted me and marched toward my table with heavy strides, Sylvia right on his heels. When they reached me, David stayed standing, planting both hands on the marble table, trying to use his size to intimidate me. His eyes were bloodshot. "What the hell is wrong with your head, Mom?" he hissed, lowering his voice only because a couple of businessmen at the next table shot him a look of disapproval. We left Matthew in the car with the AC running because I didn't want him seeing his grandmother having a full-blown attack of senile dementia. "Give us the keys to the house right now. The joke is over." I pointed at the 2 empty chairs across from me. "Sit down, or turn around and walk out the way you came in. Your choice." Sylvia let out a scoff of pure indignation. She crossed her arms over her chest and dropped roughly into one of the chairs. David's jaw clenched tight, but the absolute authority in my voice left him no choice. He sat down heavily next to his wife. "Are you sick, Margaret?" Sylvia started, shooting me a glare loaded with pure venom. "We leave you alone for 5 days and you lose your mind? Changing locks? Throwing our things away? Do you have any idea how much the furniture in the living room cost? Do you know the trauma you're going to cause your grandson when we tell him his grandmother threw us out on the street like dogs?" "Your things are not thrown away, Sylvia," I replied, using the tone of someone explaining a math problem to a slow child. "They are perfectly packed in Unit 405 of a storage facility in the South Industrial Zone. The first month is paid. You have 30 days to find a rental apartment and take them. And as for Matthew, the only trauma that boy has is growing up in a house where his parents teach him to despise his elders." David slammed his fist on the table. The ice in my glass clinked. "You are not throwing us out of anywhere," David bellowed, though he didn't dare raise his voice above the jazz music. "I am the administrator. Dad left me the legal power. Above all else, that house is as much mine as it is yours. And I'm warning you right now, Mom. If you don't hand over those keys this instant, tomorrow morning I am going straight to the bank. I am going to freeze the joint account where Dad's pension hits. I'm cutting you off. Let's see how you pay for this luxury hotel room and these fancy new clothes when you don't even have money to buy a loaf of bread. You are going to starve to death on your own pride." I let his words hang in the perfumed air of the bar. It was fascinating to observe the anatomy of his arrogance. David genuinely believed he held the winning hand. He was so blinded by his own greed that he had never bothered to look at the entire board. I opened my purse slowly, pulled out a white envelope, and slid it across the table until it rested right in front of his sweaty hands. "Open it," I commanded. David frowned, picked up the envelope, ripped the flap, and pulled out the stapled pages inside. It was the certified copy Isaac had given me, the notary seals gleaming under the lamplight. That is the document of absolute revocation, David, I said while he read. I watched the color drain from his sunburned face, turning a sickly ashen white. The administrative power your father gave you was legally canceled 3 days ago, and if you had actually read Arthur's will 5 years ago, instead of assuming you knew everything, you would have found out that his half of the house passed directly to me. You own exactly nothing. You are a guest whose invitation just expired. Sylvia leaned in to read over her husband's shoulder. Her mouth dropped open slightly, but no sound came out. But the pension, David stammered, swallowing hard, clinging to the final burning nail of his imaginary power. The bank account. I'm a joint owner. I'm going to empty it. I let out a very short laugh, almost a sigh. It was the first time I had smiled since I sat down at that table. You can keep your father's pension, David. Empty it. Use it to pay the security deposit on your new apartment, or buy yourself some sunblock, because you clearly need it. I have no interest in that joint account anymore. In fact, I removed my name from it this very morning. David looked at me like I had just started speaking an alien language. His brain simply could not process that I was voluntarily walking away from the money that, according to him, was my only lifeline. What are you going to live on then? Sylvia asked, her voice trembling, realizing for the first time that the woman sitting across from them was not the terrified old lady they had built up in their heads. Are you going to beg for change? I leaned forward slightly, rested my forearms on the marble, and looked them dead in the eye, shifting from one to the other. Do you remember my workbench? I asked, my voice low, soft, almost confidential. That oak table you dismantled and threw into a dark basement because you said my tools were ugly and smelled old? Sylvia looked away, deeply uncomfortable. David blinked, utterly confused by the change of subject. You always thought my watches were a hobby, I continued, striking every word with precision. David, you told me I fixed little watches just to entertain myself, that I lived off the charity of your father's pension. It never once occurred to you to ask why the owner of the biggest jewelry store downtown came personally in his armored car to drop pieces off at our front door. You never wondered what it cost to restore the internal mechanism of a 1940 Patek Philippe, or to clean the rust off a collector's Rolex Daytona. The silence at the table became absolute. Even the background jazz seemed to vanish. I worked every single day of my life, David. While you were stealing from your father's factory register at 20 to pay off your debts, I was assembling microscopic gears until my eyes, while Sylvia was buying minimalist furniture on credit to make me feel like I didn't fit in my own home, I was cashing checks in my name and depositing them into financial instruments that you, in your infinite ignorance, didn't even know existed. David opened his mouth to speak, but couldn't find any air. His hands, still clutching the legal document, began to tremble slightly. I went to the bank on my birthday, I said, and I pronounced the next number with a clarity that sliced through the air. I withdrew all my money from that institution. $480,000, David. $480,000 in cash, which is now bulletproofed in a private investment fund that requires my physical presence and my signature to move a single cent. I saw the physical impact of my words. It was like I had hit them dead in the center of the chest with a hammer. Sylvia let out a choked gasp and covered her mouth with her hand. David sank into his chair, his shoulders slumping, his arrogance evaporating in a millisecond. The number kept bouncing around their heads. $480,000. A fortune that had been sitting under their very roof, sleeping in the basement they themselves had designated as my dungeon. You told me I was out of phase, Sylvia, I said, turning my head to look directly at my daughter-in-law, whose eyes were now welling with tears of pure frustration. That was the word you used when you threw my life into the basement. Out of phase, out of sync, slow. I pulled the little brass loop from my pocket and set it on the table, dead center between the three of us. The worn metal gleamed under the golden lamplight. In watchmaking, when a gear is out of phase, it destroys the entire watch from the inside out, I explained to them, with the patience of a teacher speaking to students who had just failed the year. You were right, Sylvia. There was a phase issue in that house, but it wasn't me. It was you two. You were moving so fast toward ruin, so desperate to trample me just to feel important, that you didn't realize I was the mainspring. I was the one holding the tension, and the spring just snapped. Now you are the ones who are out of the watch. You are loose parts that no longer fit into my life. David dropped the papers on the table. His face was a mask of absolute despair. There was no more rage, no more threats, just the raw terror of a mediocre man realizing he had just destroyed the only person acting as his safety net. "Mom, please," David begged. His voice cracked, suddenly sounding like the frightened little boy he used to be. "Don't do this to us. We have nowhere to go today. We don't have the money to pay for a hotel or a deposit on a new place. We spent all our cash on the trip thinking we were coming back home. We're your family." Sylvia clung to that word like a castaway to a rotting plank. "Margaret, think of Matthew." My daughter-in-law whimpered, reaching her hand across the table to try and touch mine, but I pulled back before she made contact. "Matthew adores you. He's your blood, your grandson. You can't leave a child on the street. Don't be cruel." Emotional manipulation, the absolute last resort of cowards when brute force fails. Using a child as a human shield to avoid facing the consequences of their own actions. "Do not use my grandson to cover up your own misery," I replied, my voice turning to ice. "You have the car. You have the credit card Sylvia buys her shoes with. Go to a cheap motel. Go to Sylvia's parents' house. Figure your lives out like the independent adults you love to brag about being, while you were stealing my oxygen." I reached into my purse one last time. I pulled out a small, rough metal key with an orange plastic tag that had the number 405 written in black marker. I dropped it on top of the legal document. "That is the key to the storage unit where your lives are," I said, standing up and smoothing out my linen blouse. I felt a lightness in my chest I hadn't experienced since Arthur died. "You have 29 days starting today to get your things before they auction them off." David looked up at me, defeated, tiny, insignificant. "And what are you going to do?" he muttered, barely finding his voice. "Are you just going to stay in that massive house, alone and bitter, until you die?" I looked down at him from my new height. Pity finally made an appearance, but it was brief and sterile. "What I do with my property and my time, David, is no longer any of your business. But I will promise you one thing. I will never be alone again, because the worst kind of loneliness is the kind you feel when you are surrounded by people who are just waiting for you to stop breathing so they can take your shoes." I turned around without waiting for a reply. I walked across the thick carpet of the hotel bar toward the exit. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The silence I left at that table was more deafening than any scream. I raised my hand, signaled the waiter to charge the bill to my room, and walked through the glass lobby doors out onto the street. The late afternoon sun bathed the city in a warm orange glow. The air was clean, the clock was keeping perfect time, and for the first time in 5 years, I was the absolute master of every single one of its seconds. But the machinery was not yet complete. There was still one last piece to clean, a house to empty of ghosts, and an entire life to actually start living. The walk from the bar back to my room happened in a sort of conscious trance. My feet moved over the thick carpets of the hotel hallways, but I felt like I was floating, suddenly stripped of a weight I had carried for 5 years. I stepped into my room, closed the solid wood door, and leaned against it for a long time. I didn't turn on the lights. The only illumination came from the massive window, filtering the orange glow of the sunset falling over the glass buildings of the city. I kicked off my new leather shoes, walked barefoot to the center of the room, and just stood there, breathing. The air conditioner hummed with that sedative monotony found in places where no one demands anything from you. I had expected guilt to ambush me. Society trains us for that. They teach us from the time we are little girls that a mother's love is a bottomless pit of sacrifice, that a good woman must always turn the other cheek, swallow sand, and smile to keep the family together, even when that family is eating her alive from the inside. Guilt is a debt society invents for mothers so they pay for the vile things their children choose to do. But standing there in the shadows, I searched my chest for guilt, and I didn't find it. In its place, I found a massive, clean, silent space. It was the exact same perfect silence that happens when you finally fit the last gear of a Swiss watch into place, and right before you wind it, you pause to admire the mechanical harmony of the parts. Everything was in its proper place. David and Sylvia had finally crashed into the stone wall of reality, a wall they had built themselves brick by brick with their own arrogance. I had simply stepped out of the way in time to avoid being crushed by the collapse. I slept straight through that night, 10 uninterrupted hours of deep, dreamless, jump-free sleep. There were no footsteps on the floor above, no doors slamming shut. There was no demanding wail from my grandson Matthew begging for his tablet to be turned on at 3 in the morning. I woke up with the sun hitting my face full on. I stretched out in the massive bed and felt, for the first time in half a decade, that my joints weren't cracking with the resentful cold of a basement. I spent 2 full weeks living in the hotel. I needed that transition time, that decompression chamber between the war I had waged and the peace I was going to build. During those 14 days, Isaac Montgomery handled the residual bureaucracy. He called me on a Tuesday morning to inform me that David had attempted, in an act of pure desperation, to show up at the bank with his old power of attorney to demand my funds be frozen. Robert Sterling, the manager, had brought him into his office, poured him a glass of water, and showed him the notarized copy of the revocation, accompanied by a very polite warning about the legal consequences of attempting to defraud a financial institution with an invalidated document. David had stormed out of the branch, screaming obscenities into the air, escorted by 2 security guards. It was my son's final attempt to cling to a ghost. From that day on, the silence on his end was absolute. He understood that the machinery holding him up had been dismantled forever, and there were no spare parts left for him to grab onto. On the morning of the 15th day, I paid my hotel bill with my black card, grabbed my little fabric suitcase, and ordered a cab. I gave the driver the address of my house, my real house. The car dropped me off at the front gate. The morning sun illuminated the white siding. There were no cars parked in the driveway. There were no plastic toys scattered on the lawn. I slid the new, heavy, jagged key into the deadbolt and turned it. The mechanism gave way with a metallic click that sounded like a welcome. When I pushed the front door open, a gust of stale air hit my face. It was the smell of confinement. A mix of the sickeningly sweet, pungent perfume Sylvia used in her electric diffusers, and the dust that had settled over 2 weeks of absolute stillness. I left my suitcase in the entryway and started my first task. I walked through the entire ground floor, throwing open every window, every glass pane, every door that led outside. I let the cross breeze of the morning sweep through the hallways. I went into the kitchen, grabbed a massive black trash bag, and started throwing away everything they had left behind that the movers didn't consider furniture. I threw away the perfume diffusers. I threw away the fashion magazines piled on the coffee table. I threw away the ridiculous magnets covering the fridge. Then I went upstairs to what had been my bedroom, the one I shared with Arthur, the one I had been exiled from. The moving company had taken David's massive modern bed, his dressers, and his mirrors. The room was completely empty. I stood in the center, closed my eyes, and remembered exactly how the furniture had been arranged 5 years ago. That same afternoon, I hired 2 boys from the neighborhood, Mrs. Higgins' sons from across the street. I paid them generously for their time and their muscle. First, I had them drag the narrow, miserable cot out of the maid's room and leave it on the curb for the garbage truck. I never wanted to see that blown-out mattress that had dug springs into my ribs ever again. Then, I led them out to the storage shed at the back of the garden, where Arthur and I kept the furniture we weren't using. There, draped in old bed sheets, was my real bedroom set. My turned cherrywood bed, my wide-drawered dresser, my nightstands. The boys dusted off the pieces, hauled them up the stairs, and assembled everything in the exact same spot it had been before the invasion. But the most important job, the one that truly marked my return to life, happened the next day. I took the boys down to the basement, flipped on the bare bulb, and pointed to my watchmaker's bench. That solid oak table, heavy as an anvil, that David and Sylvia had banished to the dampness because it uglied up their minimalist vision of the house. Very carefully, boys, I warned them, watching them adjust their back braces. That table holds 40 years of history. Carry it to the sunroom in the back, to the spot where the sunlight hits. It was grueling work, but when I saw my oak table installed once again in front of the sunroom windows, surrounded by the indoor plants I had started buying, I felt my heart beating with a vigorous, youthful rhythm. I brought my toolboxes upstairs. I arranged my precision screwdrivers on their magnetic racks. I lined up my jars of solvents, my different densities of oil, my anti-magnetic titanium tweezers, and my miniature lathes. When I was done, I sat down on my ergonomic stool. The natural light, bright and pure, poured through the glass and bathed the green cutting mat. I would never again have to strain my eyes under a fluorescent lamp while shivering from the cold. I had reclaimed my sanctuary. I had recovered my center of gravity. The months began to pass with a delicious slowness. Time stopped being an enemy stalking me from the corners of my own home and became an ally keeping me company. I changed the curtains. I painted the walls of the main living room a warm cream tone that erased the hospital gray Sylvia had imposed. I started cooking whatever I wanted. I made slow-simmered stews that filled the house with the scent of rosemary, garlic, and red wine. I poured myself a generous glass at night and read in Arthur's wingback chair, listening to old vinyl records without anyone demanding I turn the volume down because the boy was sleeping. About 6 months after my birthday, I received a visitor. I was in the sunroom, adjusting the hairspring on an antique pocket watch, when the front doorbell rang. I took off my brass monocle, set it on the desk, and went to answer. It was Isaac Montgomery. He was wearing his usual gray suit, but he had loosened his tie and was carrying a manila folder under his arm. "Margaret, my dear, you are glowing," he said, kissing my cheek. As he walked in, his eyes swept over the entryway and the open living room, noticing the warmth, the cleanliness, the total absence of tension in the air. "This house finally smells like you again. Come in, Isaac. Let me make you some real coffee, not that instant garbage my tenants used to drink." We sat in the kitchen. The afternoon light spilled through the window over the sink, lighting up the spotless tiles. I served him a steaming cup and a slice of lemon pound cake I had baked that very morning. Isaac took a long sip, closed his eyes in appreciation, and set the cup on the saucer. He opened the folder. "I come bearing the final documents for this year's tax closing. Everything is in order. Your investment fund is generating excellent returns, well above inflation. You have a financial cushion you couldn't burn through in 3 lifetimes, Margaret. I don't plan on touching the principal, Isaac. The yields are more than enough for me to live like a queen. Besides, I've started taking commissions again." Isaac smiled, shaking his head, amazed by my work ethic. "You are incorrigible. You could be traveling on Mediterranean cruises, but you'd rather keep taking apart little machines. Cruises bore me. Machinery fascinates me. Inside a watch, if something fails, you know exactly who to blame. The rules are clear." Isaac leaned back in his chair. His expression turned a fraction more serious, adopting that confidential tone he used when he had news that wasn't strictly legal, but that he knew needed delivering. "I heard about David," he said quietly, watching my reaction over the rim of his cup. I didn't flinch. I kept my hands resting on the table, completely relaxed. My stomach didn't drop, my palms didn't sweat. It was as if he were talking about an old acquaintance from the neighborhood I had lost track of decades ago. "Tell me," I replied, my voice perfectly neutral. "As you know, they couldn't pay the second month on the storage unit. The facility followed standard protocol. They sent 2 legal notices that David ignored, probably thinking he could just bully them later, like he did with everything. By the 3rd month, they popped the lock on Unit 405 and auctioned off the contents behind closed doors." I nodded slowly. I pictured the minimalist white sofa, the massive TV, the designer shoeboxes, and the toys. All of it sold off for a fraction of its value to second-hand dealers. They had lost the stage props of their perfect life. They moved into Sylvia's parents' apartment, Isaac continued, a 2-bedroom place on the north side. According to a colleague of mine who handles some family law for them, it is absolute hell in there. Sylvia's father is a hard man. He doesn't tolerate dead weight. He forced David to take a job as an inventory supervisor at an auto parts warehouse. He's working 10-hour days on rotating shifts. Sylvia had to enroll Matthew in the local public school because they can't afford the bilingual private academy tuition anymore. And she herself is working as a receptionist at a dental clinic just to help with the grocery bills. Isaac paused, searching my eyes for any trace of remorse, any sign that the protective mother was going to wake up and run to rescue her wounded cub. But the woman sitting across from him was no longer the protective mother of a parasite. She was a watchmaker who had scrubbed her mechanism clean. "Time doesn't heal everything, Isaac," I told him, taking a bite of my pound cake. "Time only exposes what you allowed to rot, and it makes bloom what you had the courage to clean." David lived 40 years, believing the world owed him a comfortable life just for breathing. His father patted all his falls, and I let him use my back as a doormat. What is happening to him now isn't a tragedy. It's real life. He's being forced to grow up at 45. It's painful, yes, but growth always hurts. Don't you feel sorry for the boy, Matthew? I looked out the window toward the garden, where a robin was hopping around looking for insects in the grass. Matthew is a smart kid. If he had stayed here, growing up in the shadow of his parents' arrogance, learning to despise his elders and believing that screaming solves every problem, he would have turned into an exact clone of David, a burden to society and a torment to his future wife. Now he's going to have to watch his father sweat to earn his bread. He's going to have to understand the actual value of a pair of shoes. Maybe, just maybe, this free fall is the only thing that can save that boy from turning into a monster. And if someday, when he is a grown man, he wants to find his grandmother to have a cup of coffee and speak with respect, my door will be open to him. But not for his parents. Never for his parents. Isaac nodded, visibly moved by the cold, mathematical precision of my reasoning, which was not devoid of a deep, painful wisdom. We finished our coffee talking about trivial things. The weather, politics, Isaac's own retirement plans. When he left, I closed the door behind him, feeling that the very last echo of the past had finally left the house. Time, once freed from its heavy anchors, has a habit of flying light. 2 more years passed. I turned 74. My life had become a symphony of chosen routines. I woke up early, before the sun fully crested, but I no longer did it driven by the tight spring of obligation. I did it for the sheer pleasure of watching the dawn from my garden, with a cup of tea in my hands. The house was full of quiet life. I had filled the empty corners with ferns, orchids, and monsteras that grew with intense vigor. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, I walked to the downtown market to buy fresh vegetables and fish. The neighbors, who for years had only seen me pass by like a hunched gray shadow, now greeted me by name, stopped to chat, and admired my straight posture and my elegant coats. Professionally, my reputation had reached an almost mythical status within the small, hermetic circle of high-end watch collectors in the region. Without the pressure of having to hide my work or the financial need to accept every job, I became exquisitely selective. I only agreed to restore pieces that presented a true intellectual challenge. It was a late October afternoon. Autumn had painted the trees on my street a coppery red. I was sitting in the glass sunroom, working on the most complex piece that had crossed my desk in a decade. A private collector had brought me an original Breguet pocket watch, manufactured in the mid-19th century. It was a masterpiece of human engineering, featuring a finely engraved solid gold case and a white enamel dial that hid a minute repeater and a perpetual calendar movement underneath. The watch had been locked in a basement safe for 50 years, and the original oil had coagulated, turning into a thick glue that had completely paralyzed the heart of the machine. The owner told me that 3 young watchmakers in the capital had turned down the job, terrified of breaking irreplaceable components. I had been immersed in its repair for 3 weeks. I had disassembled the watch down to its most microscopic component, 284 pieces laid out on my green mat in an order only my brain understood. I had submerged every gear, every blued steel screw, every brass bridge into ultrasonic baths with special solvents. I had rubbed the pivots with pegwood to bring back their mirror polish. That afternoon, I was executing the final assembly process. I put on my watchmaker's loop, the old worn brass monocle that molded to the socket of my right eye like a second skin. I clicked on the articulating lamp, aiming the beam of white light directly onto the main plate of the watch. With my titanium tweezers, I picked up the pallet fork, a piece shaped like a ship's anchor, tiny as a pinhead, responsible for regulating the escape of energy. I held my breath. My pulse, at 74 years old, was as steady as marble. I dropped the fork into its exact place, ensuring the ruby pallets meshed perfectly with the teeth of the escape wheel. Then, I picked up the most critical piece, the balance wheel and its hairspring. It is the regulating organ, the lungs, the piece that dictates the rhythm of time. I lowered it gently onto the central axis. I tightened the microscopic screw on the bridge to secure it. I took a vial with an applicator needle and deposited a microscopic drop of synthetic oil, the size of a speck of dust, onto the friction rubies. With a tiny screwdriver, I gave the crown 3 turns to wind the mainspring. I sat completely still, watching through the magnifying glass. For 1 infinite second, nothing happened. The machine was dead. And then, as if a ghost had breathed over the metals, the balance wheel gave a tiny twitch. Then another, and suddenly it took off. It began oscillating left and right, fast, constant, frantic, and perfect. The pallet fork began biting the teeth of the escape wheel, producing that magical sound, that crystalline, rapid ticking, that is the heartbeat of an inanimate object coming back to life. I pulled the brass lobe from my eye and leaned back on the stool, letting out the breath I didn't realize I had been holding. A wide, deep, genuine smile spread across my face. The watch was resurrected. I had scrubbed away decades of neglect. I had removed the filth that paralyzed it, and now it ran with the exact same precision as the day its creator assembled it over a century ago. People believe that forgiving means forgetting, that love requires tolerating corrosion. In watchmaking, forgiving an assembly error or tolerating a rusted part means the entire machine is doomed to fail. You have to pull it out by the root, scrape off the grime without mercy, or the whole watch stops. I had simply applied the golden rule of my trade to my own existence. I clicked off the lathe light, stood up from the workbench, and walked into the kitchen to make myself some tea. While I waited for the water to boil in the kettle, I opened the top silverware drawer. There, tucked underneath the wooden organizer where I kept the spoons, was a small photo frame I had bought at the department store shortly after taking my house back. It didn't hold a picture of any relative. There were no images of weddings, baptisms, or past birthdays. Pressed under the glass of the frame, perfectly centered, was the scrap of paper, the torn half of a receipt I had found on the kitchen table that morning of my 72nd birthday. David's rushed, arrogant handwriting was still there, unchanged. "We're traveling for 5 days, Mom. Good luck." And right below it, written in my own firm, rounded, relentless script, the reply that had changed everything. "Luck is for those who don't know how to count time." I stared at the framed paper. It no longer brought me pain, or rage, or even irony. It brought me the exact same respect a sailor has for the compass that guided him out of a hurricane. That miserable scrap of paper had been the detonator of my freedom. It had been the exact drop of tension that caused the mainspring of my tolerance to finally snap. If David hadn't been so incredibly cruel as to leave me that note on my birthday, maybe I would have kept enduring the humiliation for another year. 2 more years. Waiting for a change that was never going to come, fading away slowly in the basement until I turned to dust. But they pushed me into the abyss, completely ignorant of the fact that after a lifetime of assembling complex mechanisms, I knew exactly how to build myself a pair of wings on the way down. The kettle whistled on the stove. The sharp sound sliced through the peaceful silence of the house. I tucked the frame back into the back of the drawer, right where it belonged, as an invisible reminder of what I would never again permit. I poured myself a cup of green tea, felt the heat of the steam against my face, and walked back toward the glass sunroom. The sun was beginning to set, painting the garden in long, deep purple shadows. I sat down on my stool in front of the oak table. I listened to the perfect, constant ticking of the freshly repaired Breguet watch, beating over the green mat, counting away the seconds of a life that finally belonged entirely to me. At 74 years old, I had discovered that time isn't something that runs out. It is the exact material you decide to use to forge your own dignity.